Welcome to the University of Michigan Dentistry podcast series, promoting oral health care worldwide.
On June 30th of this year, Dr. Mann, you're going to retire from the deanship of the School of Dentistry after 19 years in that position. And I'd like to, if we may, look back some 47 years and reminisce about your career this morning. I'd like to begin perhaps at the point in time that you graduated from high school and ask you probably a question that would be typical of anyone that would begin such a discussion and say, how did you become involved in dentistry from the start?
Well, I guess I got into it in a different way than most of our students do. To listen to them, when you ask the question, how did you get interested in dentistry and why did you decide to apply, many of them had started out to be chemists or something else, and for some reason or another, a roommate was studying dentistry, or they read something. They suddenly, rather late in life, decided they're going to apply and study dentistry. With me, I really don't know when I decided, except I can date things back to a paper that an English teacher of mine, a Mrs. Thornton at the Washington Junior High School in Port-Michigan, made me write when I was in either the 7th or 8th grade, and the subject of this paper was to be, what are you going to be when you grow up? So I have read that paper since. My mother kept it for some reason, and it said very clearly that I'm going to study dentistry. And my only notion as to why I wrote it that way is that we did have a dentist living across the street from us. I was no great friend of his, but I admired him, I guess. And maybe he suggested this to me. I can't really tell you why, but so from time immemorial, I was going to be a dentist, and that's all there was to it.
There was no event during your high school years where you had that interest stimulated along the way, so you didn't stray from it?
Quite the contrary. A lot of teachers tried to talk me out of it and to try to get me to study medicine. And so there was nothing that strengthened that motivation, but I kind of made up my mind and I did it.
In 1930...
If you knew me well enough, you'd know that when I do make up my mind, I don't easily change it.
In 1934, you graduated from high school in Port Huron.
That's right.
And then you came to the university here in the School of LS&A and spent what period of time?
2 years.
2 years before entering dental school.
That's right.
That would put you entering into the University of Michigan Dental School in 1936.
That's right.
What are some of your early thoughts about dental school? How did it appear?
Dentistry was in kind of a state of flux that I didn't fully appreciate until I graduated and talked with members of the faculty. The program actually was changing from a one pre-dental year, no wait, I'm sorry, that had changed it taken place. It was changing from 2 pre-dental years and 3 dental years to 4, like still as our minimum requirement. You find that there was, when I was in school, one class in my first year, the junior class had only something like 18 students in it, because the class that would have entered in 1933 was given the option to take 3 years of dentistry or 4, and they split. Most of them took 3 years. That was Don Kerr's class. And they graduated in 1937, and then a few stayed on for that 4th year and graduated in 1938. The classes were smaller. The class that I entered with had about 50 students when we started, and wound up in someplace between 30 and 35 students. At least half, and probably more, of the students were from out of state. There was no great driving interest here in this state of Michigan. Remember, this is Depression now for dentists, or for young people who study dentistry. Something that I didn't know that was taking place at that time was that the university was considering closing the dental school, just going out of business. Enrollment was not high. The classes had before the Depression struck, had student bodies of well over 100, and I think about 200. You'd have to look that up in the records, and I don't carry it in my mind, but I think they were up around 200 students per class. Now suddenly to be back with 50 and the remnants of 50, graduating 35 was not a very economical measure from the standpoint of the university administration, and for many reasons that I don't fully remember and probably never fully knew. There was this consideration of closing the school, and the faculty was out trying its best to recruit students. I think half of our, well, I shouldn't say half, but I know the faculty was small, so I suppose half. Drs. Bunning, Eastlick, Jesuit, Kemper, all of them were out at the junior colleges giving lectures on advantages of studying dentistry and of being a dentist, and trying to recruit students to the school in order just plain to keep from going under. Now, that's something we've continued, good times and bad. Obviously, we have many, many more applicants now than we can use, but we still have had someone go out every year. I did it once, Dr. Dorr, Dr. Strachan now, Dr. Jesuit did it with me at one time, visiting the small colleges and universities of this state, and the not so small ones, Wayne and Michigan State University, trying to continue to keep up the interest in the study of dentistry, so we never get in a position where people are not looking to us anymore.
When you had those class sizes of 50 and you recruited, was it to try to recruit the very best students, or was it a lack of interest of students in general at that period of time? Because
it's a lack of students of interest in general, and I think at that time, I don't want to speak harshly, but I don't think they were too concerned about getting the very best students. They couldn't do it at that point. They were just trying to get students that had C average or better.
Was that because of the Depression years?
Yes, well, at least partly. Nobody, I shouldn't say this as a harsh statement, I'm going to say nobody your age remembers this, but maybe some of you do, or somehow have been filled in by your parents or others. But you got to remember that dentistry is rather an elective type of care, and it was certainly put aside by people during the Depression. Dentists that I know, I used to go back to my hometown to visit dentists, and very few of them couldn't see you sit down with you for a half hour and smoke a cigarette on a Saturday afternoon when people often are quite busy, or were then. I know now dentists are in a good enough position, a lot of them don't even practice on Saturdays. But when a student left school, everybody thought that he was going to spend 3 to 4 years with a pretty empty appointment book before he got going, wherever he opened practice. So
we're kind of returning to that
tough.
time in 1981. I said we're kind of returning to that situation here in 1981.
A little bit of it is a bit. You can't realize how desperate it was back in the 30s. The dentist would, for example, cut fees. They would reduce fees on extractions, and then the word would get around quite quickly, and many people would be coming to that man and leaving other dentists, and then the others would have to cut their fees back, and it was a kind of a cutthroat, dog-eat-dog profession there for a while.
How was it from the student standpoint?
And ads, you don't really realize what the ads were like, or Dr. MacArthur, Dr. Toole or O'Toole, something of that sort, and others in Detroit. One of the gentlemen had a 15-minute, maybe 2 or 3 times a week program on WJR, telling about dental health from the standpoint of an advertising dentist, which wasn't the best. If you walk down Woodward Avenue and Michigan Avenue in Detroit, there would be big displays of dentures on the sidewalk and so forth. Dentistry was a little different than it is now.
When I was very young in Flint, I can recall a dentist in downtown Flint having a large tooth hanging out in the, of the front of the building, projecting out over the sidewalk, that I was told that that was the way that it was done in those years.
At one point, I'm sure it was.
In the 30s.
this state did a good job of cleaning that up through the efforts of a number of people on our faculty, plus others throughout the state. Dr. Jesuit was one who was very active in helping to get through the legislation, which really was a referendum in the year 1939, which the profession went to the people and asked them to vote that there should not be advertising by members of the dental profession, and it won, and that cleaned up the state very, very beautifully until more recently when the Federal Trade Commission and others say that we can't restrain people, they must be permitted to advertise.
I haven't seen any teeth projecting out from buildings
yet. No, not to date.
Yet.
It hasn't gotten that bad. I hope it never does.
How did the time period that we're talking about, 1936 to 40, look from the student's point of view? Students today are in debt for their dental education. Certainly that must have been true in those tough economic times.
I mean, it
late
was
30s.
true, and there weren't the loan funds and scholarship funds to turn to then that there are now. And it was hard. You really kind of had to have your money in hand. But of course, one of the things that people did was to work while going through school. And some of the people in dental school did all kinds of things. Waiting table was one of the, in fraternities and sororities and restaurants, was one of the things that the individual tried to do. And there they could wait table for the breakfast trade, maybe usually not do anything at noon, but do it in the evening, and in that way you get enough, usually food to eat. Usually they didn't get money, they were actually paid with by getting their meals wherever they worked, maybe some small amount in addition. I remember a man who's dead now who had a career in the Michigan Health Department, and when we were in school we sat next to each other because my name was Mann, M-A-N-N, and his was Manty, M-A-N-T-Y. And poor Manty from the Upper Peninsula didn't have much money at all, and he sold his blood. And where I know you can read that you're not supposed to give blood oftener than certain intervals, they sometimes called him out twice within a week. And he was kind of a worn-out individual, and he flunked out of school, a very intelligent person who, as I say, did have a good career in the state health department afterward, but never made it as a dentist. So people were always trying to find some way to make a little money, but things, of course, obviously were much, much cheaper. I used to eat lunch regularly down at at that time was Miller's Drugstore, which is now a bank on the corner and just across the street from Hill Auditorium. And I would usually get a barbecue and a piece of pie. It was 15 cents. And so we didn't need as much, but 15 cents came were hard to come by at that moment.
I would imagine. What was tuition at that time? Do you recall?
I'm not sure. I had a Regents scholarship, and I think the dental school tuition might have been $150. I know I was paying about $50 per term. So that was much lower, of course, than it is now. The school was different. Obviously, the faculty was much smaller. There were two full-time teachers on the faculty while I was in school. One was not here very much because he was courting a woman in Chicago, and he would leave Thursday afternoon, generally come back Tuesday morning, so he wasn't around too much. And the other one was actually practicing about half-time, and they had to straighten out his appointment before too long and call him half-time instead of full-time. So everybody had practice or something that they were doing. There were only a handful, 3 or 4 people that worked here during the summer. The place closed down early in June and didn't open up until late in September, and you could walk around the halls and be lonesome. The only activities, there were one or two secretaries in the dean's office that kept that going, a secretary in the continuing education office, and the orthodontic department had a secretary and one or two graduate students, and they just had to keep the patients going through the summer, and that's the only reason they kept going. And Dr. Ward and Dr. Payton were active in their research laboratory, and that was it.
Who was the dean at the time?
The dean was Dr. Bunning. Dr. Ward served as dean from 1916 to 1934. And that year, there were a lot of hassling, pulling and tawing between faculty and alumni and what have you. He was relieved of his duties, and an oral surgeon of that time, Dr. Chalmers Lyons. You heard of the Chalmers Lyons Study Club, but there was a Chalmers Lyons, and he was the head of oral surgery, and he was made, I've forgotten what they call him, an acting dean or something of that sort. And he died within a year, and for probably 2 or 3 years, the school functioned under an executive committee with Dr. Bunning, the chairman of it. And then along about 1937 or 38, they made him actual dean, and he was dean from then until 1950. Dr. Jedwick from 1950 to 62. And I began teaching on the faculty in 1940. And it was strange. I put in the first year as a clinical instructor, and my appointment was from September till the middle of June. And I'd started a research project with in dental materials, and people wanted that continued. So I was on a $100 a month salary. I was losing ground, all right, even in those days on that, because rents have always been high in Ann Arbor, and about $55 of the 100 was going into rent. So anyway, I got a big bonus. I think it was $500 they managed to get from someplace for me to work during the summer. And then that would be the summer of 41. And by the summer of 1942, we were in World War II, and everybody had to go on 12 months because we went on what was called an accelerated program. And the students were in school 12 months of the year.
Were they trying to produce dentists in a shorter time span?
Yes.
I see.
And this school really fudged things. If the war had gone longer, it would have been shown that we had not really gone on a true accelerated program, because an accelerated program means that if you have a 9-month curriculum, you accept somebody every 9 months, and instead of graduating a student body over a 4-year period of 48 months, it's 4 times 9, 36, and you graduate people in 3 years with the equivalent of a 4-year curriculum. And what our school did was simply to fill in summers with, I wouldn't call it quite busy work, but took some of the laboratory courses and so forth and put them in the summer. And really, because our clinic was a hot place and nobody wanted to open it up and try to treat patients in there in the summer, we really weren't going to graduate those students any earlier. A little bit, but not cutting them back down like I've been talking about. They weren't really in there for 4 years, but they didn't get out, wouldn't have gotten out in 36. But everything worked out. The war ended, and we had accomplished as much as anybody else in our own little way. It was so hot around that older building. Again, I know you went to school there, didn't you, Joe?
Yes, yes, I did.
And you wouldn't have been there, I guess, in the summer, but that clinic was like a greenhouse. And
I've walked through it several times.
Yeah.
I have a feeling for what you're saying.
And you had to open the windows up, and we didn't have good screens. It was a kind of a mess. So summer was a bad, bad time.
Lots of birds in there.
Pigeons. We used to have the pigeons up in the rafters. It was kind of a mess. So anyway, you talked to me one time earlier about this program, and I told you one thing, and you said you wanted me to repeat. I used to headquarter, because of the project that I had, down in Dr. Ward's laboratory. And Dr. Ward is a figure that is simply a name to most people, probably to yourself. I don't know if you remember even what he looked like.
No.
Slender, white-haired man, and very stern, strict kind of person. I suppose if he weighed 130 pounds wringing wet, it would have been pretty good. But I went up to his laboratory one hot July day, and I don't know what I probably had some kind of a coat on, but I was wearing a T-shirt. And he saw me like that and took me aside and gave me a real discussion about how professional people didn't dress that way, particularly people who were on the faculty of the school. And as I told you, I guess I respected his admonition, because I've never worn anything but a shirt and tie to the school since, except one day I can recall ducking in here once to get something quickly. But other than that, I've always lived up to what the old man wanted me to do. And he was a person that I grew very close to. My two grandfathers died when I was a youngster, small. I remember them, but not didn't have any kind of adult contact with them. And I think he kind of filled a role in my life, kind of a grandfather person. And we knew each other very well from about 41 until he died in 63, I think it was. I can't tell you how many times I played bridge with him or played golf with him. He was an interesting man, because he'd been born in 1875, which is a long time ago, and when he was 12 years old, his grandfather presented him with a rifle, and he lived up near Howell, Michigan. And again, it sounds kind of old and far away, but a man who ran the sporting goods store in Howell had been a sharpshooter with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And he took Dr. Ward under his wing as a 12-year-old and taught him how to shoot. And Marcus was good with a gun. He was, I think, twice the skeet or trap, I don't know, one of the other champions of the state of Michigan. He was very discouraging to those he went hunting with. I remember the story they told around here at one time about half a dozen of them going to hunt pheasant over near Chelsea. And a dog flushed a couple of birds, and one went one direction, one another. Dr. Ward shot one, turned, shot the other, and that was his limit. He was through for the day, and the others, I don't know if they got anything all day. But when World War II broke out, he had about as good a collection of guns as anybody in the country, I guess. And Abercrombie and Fitch during World War II, when they had a customer they really wanted to please, would get in touch with Dr. Ward and try to talk him out of one of his guns, and he often let him have one. But he was a person who wanted to excel in everything he did, and he did, obviously, in the use of a gun. He was good at golf, good in bridge, and about anything he touched.
You mentioned earlier that after his time as the dean, when he was relieved of those duties, he continued as a faculty person?
He was a teacher, yes.
Until his retirement?
Chairman of the Department of Dental Materials.
And Dr. Payton that you mentioned, would that be Floyd Payton?
Floyd Payton, mm-hmm.
And I can remember him when I was in school. He was one of my professors. And
Floyd came here as a young man about 1928 or something sort, and got a PhD degree in, I can't tell you, some aspect of chemistry, and then joined Dr. Ward's department. He left it for 3 years, going to Texas from 45 to 48, I believe it was, and came back in 48. Now he's in Sun City down in Florida.
I see.
Taking it easy. Mm-hmm.
He would represent one of the real pioneers of non-dentists in the history of the school, wouldn't he? Dr. Payton and also Professor Richards, I think, were two non-dentists early in the faculty.
I'm at a loss. There was a man by the name of Scott, and I don't know what his first name was, who had been a high school teacher of physics. who was preceded Dr. Payton with Dr. Ward, and did a great deal of the early work. Scott did, or collaborated with Ward on amalgam. Dr. Bunting always seemed to have somebody around working for him in dental caries research. Mary Crowley, you may remember, but
Yes,
she was preceded by a couple of people whose names I don't really recall. So while the people you mentioned certainly were contributors, there were people here before them filling those roles as non-dentists.
Dr. Bunting was a pioneer in periodontal research, if I recall, wasn't he involved heavily in caries research as well?
There's a statue around the building, I don't know where it is, a bust. Willoughby D. Miller, and there's a little plaque out in front of along the side of the Kellogg building by him. Willoughby D. Miller was another individual who was, I think he's probably called it dean at this school. He graduated in dentistry from maybe Pennsylvania, I don't really know. And I think that he graduated from LS&A here before he took dentistry. And then he went to Berlin and practiced in Germany for a long time, and wrote some books on bacteriology or microbiology related to dental caries. Then he was asked to return and become the dean early in the 1900s, and I can't tell you the year again. You'd have to look it up. That's easily done. And he came with all his belongings and here to Ann Arbor, and then he went down to visit family in Ohio, had an attack of appendicitis and died. And Dr. Bunting took over a lot of his materials that he had, physical things, by that I mean slides and other items, and built on it in a very ethical way, on his dental caries research particularly. And then, as you say, Dr. Bunting did get involved with people in this area and studied periodontics, and he was one of the pioneers in that field. Sure he was.
If I recall the history, Dr. Bunting married Dorothy Hard. Is my history correct?
Well, that was his second wife.
Second wife.
Dr. Bunting had another wife, and I don't know, can't remember what her first name was. I can still remember, though, about, I got mixed up with Latin American students in the early 40s and was chaperoning them around from here to there at the request of Dr. Jesuit primarily and the people in the Kellogg Foundation. And one night, the Buntings had a cocktail party to honor. It would either have been 10 or 20, whichever it was, Kellogg people, because we used to bring them in groups of either 10 or 20. And these, I got them in line, and Dr. Bunting and his wife, and I don't know if somebody else formed a receiving line, and I shepherded these people along, brought up the end, and each one introduced himself to Mrs. Bunting, and when I came along, I'd met Mrs. Bunting on several occasions as a young teacher, but she looked at me and said, well, young man, and what country are you from? But then she died, and Dr. Bunting married Dr. Hard.
And she was subsequently the director of dental hygiene here.
She was the director at that time.
At that time.
Had been for years, yeah.
And I can recall...
She was a dentist, and I think she was director of the dental hygiene program from the earlier mid-20s when it was started here.
Were you married during dental school?
No, very few people were. That was nobody had money to do things like that. You had to be very, very venturesome or have a wife with a prospective wife with a good job or something of that sort, or you didn't do it. Jerry Bonnet, that you know, was married in our senior year, I believe. One other person, but you didn't find many married folks.
Are there other of your classmates that were on the faculty, like Dr. Bonnet? Are you and Dr. Bonnet the only people from your class that were
Hugh Godfrey, more around Northville, was on faculty for 2 or 3 years right after we got out of school. And I guess that is it.
In terms of the instructors that were here, either while you were in dental school or in your early teaching career, who are some of the more colorful characters? Names like Summers and Ostrander are names that were colorful people that I can recall in the early 60s that were here. I wonder if you have some outstanding names that you can recall.
Well, probably the most colorful was a person that you must have known too, and that's Louis Schultz.
We called him the Silver Fox because of his very beautiful, brilliant white hair.
Well, at any period of time, he was bound to be colorful, and he was. And the rest of the faculty, I'm not sure how I would rate them in terms of being colorful, but the ones that we were actively engaged with and that were the most prominent of the times, Dr. Kemper in oral surgery, and of course Ralph Summer in endodontics, and Dr. Jeserich in operative dentistry and administration. I guess in a way Dr. Ward would have qualified as a colorful person. He was an interesting man, always. Dr. Whitman was in charge of preclinical, or basic techniques as it was called then, and he was a person everybody admired. U.G. Rickert was a colorful person. He used to be full of stories from the travels he had. He died when we were just beginning our junior year. George Moore was there in orthodontics. I'm sure I'm forgetting. O.C. Applegate and Dick Kingery in prosthodontics, and Frank Vedder. That was Shorty Nisley, Roland Nisley, Bob Nisley's father, one of the closest friends I ever had around here. Real fine person. These were the men that made up the faculty. Phil Northrop was another one. Ralph Boyer.
His son, Phil's son, was in my class.
Was he?
Bob
Yes,
Northrop.
no, he's down in Florida.
Yes, that's right, Central Florida.
Yeah.
Some of those names, as you read them off, have become very historical people in the minds of present-day dentists.
I know. Did I say Ken Eastlick? I hope I did. He certainly
Earlier you mentioned him.
Yeah, he...
Great man in dentistry.
Because he not only started the... starts a pretty broad word to use, but he had a lot to do with the development both of pedodontics as a specialty and of public health dentistry. And some of these men contributed immensely.
Incredible accomplishments of some of these people that made Michigan.
Dr. Ward had something to do with that, with some of those people too, because he took Ralph Summer and said, okay, you're going to be in charge of endodontics. And I don't know if Ralph Summer at that point knew what endodontics was, but he went forward and did it. Dr. Ward had a lot to do with the selection of George Moore in orthodontics. The school employed a man by the name of Leroy Johnson, from a man who later became dean at Harvard, and brought him out here. This would be in 1923, I believe. He was chairman of the orthodontic department for a year and had so much trouble with faculty he left. So at that point, Dr. Ward decided that the person he wanted to do it was George Moore, who was then a very young person. And he kind of got him through the first years by having someone whose name escapes me come up from St. Louis, maybe once a month, and spend a few days here. And he was the titular head while Moore was carrying on, and then ultimately he faded from the picture. Dr. Ward got Dr. Kemper in here as the chairman of the oral surgery department, and then he took Dr. Eastlick and shoved these responsibilities of pedodontics and public health on him. He did a lot of that sort of thing, and the people responded well and did excellent jobs. I don't think anybody could ever argue with what Summer and Eastlick, did in response to the mission that Ward set them off on.
I think a lot of the work of those individuals is still highly regarded and
Sure it is.
brought a lot of favorable light on the
Sure,
University of Michigan
right.
today.
I know that's true.
From the student standpoint, during this time period, I'd be interested in your perspective of how students related to dental school, the work. Was it an intense program as it is today? Was it more or less intense? Or how did you perceive it?
It was intense, and as I've indicated before, because of the necessity for for a lot of them to produce some of the income to maintain themselves, it was a hard whole road that they were hoeing. And one thing about it, there was no summer school. There was no remedial program in preclinical dentistry, anything like that. You kind of sunk or you
Sink or
swam
swim.
right then. And I think you could take anatomy over it if you failed it. But other than that, you did it or you didn't do it. So nobody went to school 12 months of the year like some students are doing now. So in that way, everybody had summer to work. That was for financial gain to get ready for the next year. But I think students are students, and they thought they were put upon. They had arguments, or not arguments that they presented orally, but they disagreed with the faculty about this or that and griped about this and that. I don't know that has changed a great deal. I believe that dentistry is a subject that is taught in such a one-to-one basis, and every so often the teacher has to tell a student to go do something over and so forth. It's hard to be too popular with all the students. I know that's true.
There's a lot of ego and investment of someone's time
That's
involved
sure
in what they're
there is,
doing.
There is. So I don't know.
Certainly you didn't have the modern technology of high-speed handpieces and
well,
modern
that was
equipment
quite
and
different.
materials.
No, that was
No
very
television.
different. No television.
You had
In
more
fact,
of
hardly enough room for some of the things that the teachers didn't have offices. That's one thing that always struck me about the old dental school, and I guess it sewed away in my mind the idea that we should try to get something better if we ever had the opportunity. Of course, I don't mean that while I was in school, because I had no idea while I was in school that I was ever going to be on the faculty. And that came about by, in my senior years, it does with those who are invited back as clinical instructors, when Dr. Applegate talked to me about staying. At that point, I had was in about that much of signing a lease on an office building, or an office space in Battle Creek. But back to that, I had the notion that you could always enter practice, but probably only have one opportunity in your life to enter teaching, and so I would enter it and see if I liked it. And
apparently you did.
Yeah, I started in and did graduate work right away in prosthetic dentistry, but I suppose one of the things that intrigued me was getting involved to a small degree, but in almost at once in administration, and I know that probably intrigued me and kept me around here. In the year probably 1942, I would guess, or 43, we had a group of Latin American students coming up here, and that had started off because in 42, a group of Latin American dentists, one by themselves, came to this country and ran out of money. And they were down in Louisiana or some such place. And the word got to the State Department. How it ever did, I don't know, but somebody found out that there was this group of Latin American dentists without money. I don't know, maybe they had tickets home, maybe they didn't, I don't know. So they raised the issue with the State Department under the terms of the good neighbor policy that Franklin Roosevelt had instituted, and they were trying very desperately to implement during World War II. This was just the beginning stages of World War II. And however it happens, somebody in Washington must have known a man by the name of Dan Lynch, who was the chairman of the International Relations Committee of the American Dental Association. And he got in touch with Emory Morris at the Kellogg Foundation, because there was money. Emory Morris, if you don't know who he was a graduate of this school in 1928 who went over and began practicing in Battle Creek. And he was approached by the Kellogg Foundation when it organized in 1930. He'd only been out of school 2 years, but they wanted somebody who would represent dentistry. They were trying to get all the health professions. Emory at that time was working for the Board of Education as a school dentist part-time. I've told you it was hard to get started. So you didn't walk over there and start a practice. If you could find little part-time jobs as a school dentist or whatever you were doing, why you took it. And that's how he happened to make this connection with the Kellogg Foundation. And then later they found out that he was kind of a wizard with money. Before long he was treasurer of the foundation, ultimately became president and later chairman of the board. But at that particular time he was more interested in dentistry than anything else, and that's what they called upon him for. And he produced the funds, and they brought those dentists from Louisiana up here to Michigan, and they spent maybe a month and then went on their way. But that led to a program where one dentist from each country would be selected each year or twice a year and brought up here for about a 3-month program. It was organized. Basically, the program was here. There were a couple weeks at Northwestern afterwards and a couple weeks at Philadelphia at Pennsylvania, University of Pennsylvania. So that first year that the 20 were to come here, they were to come in, I believe it was August, and Dr. Schultz was supposed to handle quite a bit of the administrative work just related to that program. I don't mean it was a full-time job or anything else, because he was the head of operative dentistry. And he suddenly wound up in the hospital with a collapsed lung. And I don't know, I guess I haven't told you, I think I was the only 12-month person, other than those two I talked about earlier, on the faculty. So they seized upon me, and I handled that part, which wasn't great with these Latin American dentists. But that kind of intrigued me, and I probably pushed myself forward into that and got quite involved with the Latin American program, and through that on into continuing educational programs and the graduate program, all these programs of the Kellogg Institute, and that's really what got me intrigued and started and what's kept me here, I believe.
Do you think the continuance of students coming from those countries has stemmed from those early activities?
Sure. The people that we had here in the mid-40s and late 40s went back, and they'd been rather carefully selected, so maybe they were leaders to begin with, but the experience that they had here helped them quite a bit, and they became leaders down there, and they would send people up here whenever they could, and so yes, that it had a great deal to do with over the years. And we have a nucleus of people. More recently, they've obtained graduate degrees. Before they had not. They'd had 3 to 6 months experience at school here. But somebody who's been around here as long as I have can go to Lima, Peru, Santiago, Chile, Buenos Aires, Rio, Sao Paulo, I don't care, all through Central America. And there's a nucleus of dentists there that you immediately contact with. It makes a visit to those countries much different. You can accomplish something if you are there professionally, and if you're just there socially, you get into the houses of people and do things that lots of folks would like to, but never are able to, because the folks generally are kind of standoffish. But they've all been in our homes up here too. It's been a two-way deal.
And you have traveled in those areas extensively over the years, haven't you?
I've traveled there and I've worked there. I've gone down a number of times with as a visiting teacher or consultant with my expenses paid by the Kellogg Foundation, other times by the Pan American Health Organization, which is a division of the World Health Organization. Sometimes, as I recall, yes, I recall, at the expense of those schools or countries themselves. And then I've gone just, I've been down there enough times that if you were to ask me where I would like to go for a month's vacation, I might say London, England, but other than that one spot, there's no place else in the world I'd rather be than literally Central America. I like London a lot, but I like San Jose, Costa Rica about as well as, and it's because of the people that I know there. It's a pretty country, got a nice climate, rains a lot at one time of the year. At one point in my life, I thought that upon retirement, I would like to go and live in Costa Rica. But as you become older and more rational, you realize that you can't quite leave your country and your friends and your medical care and all that sort of thing. I like Panama immensely, and a country that I think has one of the nicest climates I've ever encountered, nice people. And 10 years ago, I could have been talked into going and spending quite a bit of time in El Salvador. And it grieves me tremendously what's going on in that country. It's just ruining what I thought was a really nice place.
You have
and
also,
I won't get into the politics of it, but I've got my positions on that too.
yeah, I'm sure. I know that you have received several awards that were related to your work with the people from Central and South America, and I'm sure that that must be of immense pride for you to have been honored for your activities on an international level.
Oh, sure, but that doesn't mean as much as just seeing what we've accomplished. I spent basically three-week periods at the dental school in Costa Rica. I've been there other times too, but first time was 57, and then about, I'm not going to try to name the other times, but then the early 60s and mid-60s. And we started off with a little old, pretty complacent Latin American school, developed a curriculum that, on paper at any rate, is comparable to those in the United States. It's hard to get the teachers with the training that ours do, so I'm not saying that they're equivalent in terms of what students are offered. But we were able to get fellowship funds from the Kellogg Foundation to train at least one person in every major department, and most of them here at Michigan. Ultimately, by stimulating them and not really doing too much myself, they got a new dental building. And so from a little old school, literally now, occupying a big, good-sized area in the basement and the first floor of the law school, where you weren't very far from horrible-smelling bathrooms and things of that sort. It turned into a very modern building, good program. I think that they're outstanding within Latin America. So something like that means a lot more to me than any award I would ever get.
I've talked with several people from Venezuela and
Yes.
Brazil, and when they speak of the University of Michigan, they always have a tone of respect. They revere the name of the University of Michigan. There's, even to an extent that's greater than graduates that are American citizens, I sense from many of them. They have a real fondness for the university. That,
but I think this school has made its mark in dentistry at any rate in a lot of places down there. It's hard to get them to really convince, though. Something you said triggered me. We used to have, a long time ago, I had a young man by the name of Rodriguez up here from Costa Rica, and he'd been educated in France, actually. He still practices in a town by the name of Punta Arenas, and I've seen him occasionally down there. But he came up in the early 40s, I guess it would be. And Michigan was going to play Notre Dame in football. Well, he thought this was a cinch because all he'd ever heard was Notre Dame. And my wife and I took him, and the three of us went down, and Michigan beat Notre Dame, and he never could quite understand this. Because from afar, there was really one university in the United States. That was the University of Notre Dame, and the rest of them are around here, and he was willing to accept us. But
Of course, we
in
all
dentistry, we've taught Notre Dame. They haven't got dental school.
I'm amazed today the number of people from other countries, particularly in Europe, that view the University of Michigan very much like Notre Dame in today's
good.
history. You know, they seem to have
Keep
shifted.
fooled so much the better.
True. I'm wondering, you mentioned several of the instructors that were here, administrators and so forth. If there's one or two, perhaps, people that you feel influenced your career, either from the early times or later.
Oh, sure there are, and they're hard to start naming names without naming almost too many. But the one man that I've already mentioned was Dr. Ward. Another person that had immense influence on me was Dr. Jesuit, Paul Jesuit. And while he was, I guess, technically old enough to have been my father, we had a relationship more like younger brother, older brother, and I learned a lot from him about dental, from both of these men, about dental education in general. And Dr. Ward had been one of the pioneers of the Carnegie people and doing away with the proprietary schools in this country. And Dr. Jesuit had been active in developing continuing education and graduate education in this country. The other people, of course, if it hadn't been for O.C. Applegate, I probably never would have stayed here to begin with. I practiced with Dick Kingery for a while, and I've always had the highest kind of regard for him.
You're in private practice with
Yes,
him?
for not very long, but for a while. I've already mentioned the friendship I had with Rowan Nisley, Shorty, as we used to call him, one of the real fine people I've ever known. And I can't leave out Ken Eastlick. Different kind of a person, but hard-working man, driving man. Now I'm sticking with people who aren't alive anymore. I don't want to get into those that are alive.
Do you think that these relationships were easier to develop in those years when the school was smaller than today, when people are so diffuse, to have someone that you can look to and pick out and say, this person?
I can't answer it. I don't know.
It seems like the climate
I
for
have no idea.
closer relationship was in the
makes sense
smaller.
what you're saying, but I don't know. I guess there are always times for friendships, and
Oh, indeed,
they
sure.
develop in certain ways, and I don't know what's going on of that variety around school.
Whenever I've talked with anyone about the history of the school, they tend to make comments along the line that when it was smaller, it was easier to know more people and be closer and so forth.
Maybe.
What did you teach before you got involved in
I taught partial denture prosthesis and operative dentistry.
both of those? Did you enjoy the teaching activities more or less than the administrative activities? It seems like you channeled very early.
It's one of those things, I guess you don't know what you've got when you've got it. When I was teaching actively on the clinic floor, there was always something in the administration I wanted to do, and a lot of times I felt like the clinical teaching was interfering with some of the things I felt I had to get done. But later on, when I've been involved in administration on a virtually 100% time basis, I've looked back at those times when I was teaching clinical dentistry and realized that those were pretty happy times. You could accomplish more, or at least you could see what you'd accomplished, and much more readily than you often can when you're fooling around in administration. So I'm not giving you much of an answer, but I guess it's the grass always looks greener on the other side, whatever.
That's true of many things.
Yeah.
You've been listening to a presentation from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, which is dedicated to supporting open learning and open educational resources. This recording is licensed under the Creative Commons. It may be reused and redistributed for nonprofit use. Please attribute materials to the University of Michigan School of Dentistry and redistribute under this same license. For more information on how this and other University of Michigan School of Dentistry recordings may be used, visit www.dent.umich.edu/license.